Welcome to the late night shift. My name is Lavender. Tonight, we dive into a special episode dedicated to the brave people who fought for the free world in World War I. So stiffen that upper lip, Private, because there's ghosts on the battlefield.
People look at you today, 20 years later, and they still have no idea what you're about. What you're about. What you're about. What you're about.
Death's Messenger, July 18th, 1918, Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. At 10 o'clock in the morning, my mother saw my brother Thomas walk into the house with a duffel bag in hand. He smiled at her and said, "Mother, I'm home." Although my mother had received a letter from him the day before postmarked France, she rushed to greet him with open arms. But when she reached the spot where he was standing, he was gone. She was inconsolable, for she was certain that her oldest child had died. 3 days later, the telegram arrived stating that Thomas had indeed been killed in action. 1 year later, my father fell ill. Once again, Thomas appeared to my mother, carrying the same duffel bag in his hand, and said, "Sorry, Mother." That night, my father died. 3 months later, my 4-year-old brother had convulsions, and once again, Thomas appeared to my mother. She knew then that my little brother would not last the night. He died that evening. She's 83 now, and we fear that Thomas' next visit will mean that she herself will go to join him. The Voice in Death Valley, June 1918. I was a member of the famous Keystone Division, Pennsylvania's own 28th Combat Division, which had been ordered to support the front line in the Ain Marne sector. We were stationed in a small narrow valley immediately in the rear. Receiving orders to dig in, we used our trench shovels to dig small dugouts which protected us from everything except a direct hit. The Germans were shelling us with high explosives and we had casualties every day. For this reason, the boys named the place Death Valley. One day I was dozing in the forecastle, sidearm close at hand, knapsack at my feet, my weary head resting on my folded coat, which contained my wallet. I usually carried my wallet in my shirt pocket over my heart because it contained a photo of my wife, a few personal papers, and numerous francs. No shelling was going on at the time, neither by us or the Germans, and the air was heavy with a foreboding quiet. I was settling into a deeper sleep when I heard my nickname called. "Rosie." The voice had an urgent tone. I thought I was just dreaming, but I wondered who amongst the boys knew me by that nickname, which was used only by my immediate family. I heard my nickname called for a second time. "Rosie." The voice seemed much closer and more urgent. Puzzled and with an eerie feeling, I sat up and looked around. Most of the boys were resting in their foxholes, while a few were sitting up, cleaning and polishing their weapons. None of the men sufficiently close to me seemed to be trying to attract my attention. When the summons came for a third time, "Rosie!" it was screamed into my ears. Frightened this time, I leaped from the foxhole and raced down the slope. After I had covered about 30 feet, I heard the rumbling and whine of a German shell. I knew by the sound that it was going to fall very close. At once I dropped to the ground and buried my face in the dirt. The shell exploded so near at hand that some of the scattering pieces hit my helmet. When I regained my composure and returned to my foxhole, I saw that it had disappeared. In its place was a large shell hole, with here and there fragments of my equipment and tattered shreds of my coat and knapsack. It had been a direct hit. Smirking Airman, 1919, unspecified RAF base. In 1975, the 78-year-old retired Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard published the story of a photograph that he'd kept for many years. It was a group photograph of his squadron, taken in early 1919 at the end of World War I, and portrayed some 200 men and women who survived the fighting. Being an official RAF photograph, nobody could have tampered with either the photograph or its negative at any time. When the photo was developed, it was placed on the squadron bulletin board so that those who wanted copies could sign up for them. There was one thing wrong though. An extra face can be seen in the photograph, alleged to belong to Airman Freddie Jackson. Jackson was a mechanic who died by heedlessly walking into a spinning propeller 2 days before the squadron, which was to be disbanded, posed for the photo. It's alleged his funeral took place on the day that the squadron had gathered for the photo. In the photo, everyone is wearing a hat but Jackson. Everyone is looking grim except Jackson, who is smiling enigmatically. Is the face in the photo really that of Jackson's spirit? Goddard and the others in the squadron were convinced it was. The Flying Coffin, April 28, 1916. Officers and mechanics at a small aerodrome in France behind the front lines were engaged in their daily routines when suddenly one of them uttered an exclamation and pointed into the sky. A single-seat Newport fighter had come out of the clouds and was circling about crazily. Every man on the field stared in grim fascination as the plane came nearer. The craft, riddled with enemy bullets, descended towards the field. The pilot did not cut the throttle. The plane droned along at the same steady speed. Everyone held their breath, expecting disaster. Then smiles broke out as the plane managed to make a perfect three-point landing. The sighs of relief were short-lived, for the plane did not stop and went into a ground loop and crashed. It was identified as the plane of Lieutenant Peretti. Field attachés rushed to the plane and pulled Lieutenant Peretti out, but he was already dead. The strange part of it was that he had not been killed in the crash. It was discovered that he had been shot cleanly through the head. Death almost certainly would have been instantaneous. How then, with a dead man at the controls, had the plane managed to get back so unerringly from the front to its home base? The Ghost of a Friend, August 3rd, 1916, Galicia, present-day Western Ukraine. During the First World War, on the night of August 3rd, 1916, the guns were silent near Galicia. It was the lull before the storm. The staff of the Austro-Hungarian army knew that the next day, the Russian army would begin a brutal assault. Alpari Imre, a Hungarian sergeant, lay on a straw mattress in a trench. Alpari was a doctor in civilian life, but had been pressed into service to fight for his country. That night, an apparition of Imre's best friend appeared in the trench. Alpari had not seen his friend since the war began. He looked pale, and wore a full dress uniform with all his decorations. His friend alleged to say, "I want to help you because there is danger ahead. If you listen to my advice, you'll be saved. Tomorrow, a bayonet will wound you. Then a grenade explosion will cause you to lose consciousness. When you regain consciousness, you must run towards the Russian front, where you will find a wounded Austrian officer. You will help him, but then you will be captured. After 16 months, you will be released." At this point, the vision of Alpari's spectral friend vanished into thin air. That night, Alpari wrote a letter to his parents describing his strange encounter. Early the next morning, the Russian offensive began. Alpari was injured by a bayonet and knocked unconscious by the shock of a grenade blast. Regaining consciousness, he headed towards the Russian front, where he found a wounded comrade lying on the ground unconscious. Alpari picked the man up and carried him to the Russian first aid station. He was taken prisoner and remained in a prisoner of war camp for 16 months. Alpari later learned that his friend had died in a battle in Russia in 1914, nearly 2 years before Alpari had been visited by him. The Phantom Barrage, August 15, 1918, Verdun, France. I was assigned during World War I to the 3rd Battalion of the 137th Infantry Regiment as one of the signalmen. Our battalion was holding a portion of the frontline trenches near Verdun, known as the Manuele sector. It was relatively quiet, and at places our trenches were separated from those of the enemy by a valley over a mile across, leaving a wide no man's land. Our battalion headquarters was situated in an excavated area on top of a high hill that presented a rocky, perpendicular front to the enemy, and was only about 100 yards in the rear of our own frontline trenches. We had several observation posts located on this perpendicular area, which commanded an unobstructed view for several miles both up and down the valley. I was on duty in the signal lookout station at the 2 AM to 4 AM watch. All was quiet along the entire front. The signalman on watch with me had just returned from the kitchen with coffee and a sandwich for our lunch. It was perhaps 2:15 when we heard a swish of artillery shells passing overhead. At first there was 5 or 6 in a minute, then they increased until the noise was continuous. We phoned artillery headquarters to verify our observations and were told that no guns in that sector were in action. We asked if there were shells bursting towards the rear area, but there were none. We couldn't hear any shells burst on either side, nor could we hear any gun explosions, and assumed it must be the long-range cannon firing from our extreme rear. We entered our observations in our reports and also called and alerted the 137th Regiment officers. This bombardment continued for over an hour and then ceased as suddenly as it began. There was much comment the next day as to who fired the shells and what had been their target. 2 nights later, some German prisoners were taken. They told our officers that 2 nights previously they had been moving supplies and artillery up from Metz under cover of darkness and were preparing for a drive on our sectors. Suddenly, and with extreme accuracy, our artillery had sent over a barrage which completely demolished every piece of equipment they had. Our officers attempted to ascertain which artillery had fired, but the entire area reported no action that night. The old French soldiers wisely nodded their heads, took a sip of their vin rouge and said, "Ils ne passent pas." Those who died before Verdun have seen to that.